All right, everyone, let's continue talking about selecting pixels. So the up here we have the rectangular select and the ellipse select. Those are great as long as everything you're selecting is a square or a circle. But a lot of times in life, that's not the way it is. Things might be a little bit more organic, a little bit more of an awkward shape. So for that, we need some additional tools to help us select. Next thing we're going to talk about is called the lasso tool. If you're not quite sure what a lasso is, a lasso used in cowboy movies and by ranchers and things like that is a piece of rope that comes out and then it comes back to itself. Okay. This creates a slip knot that captures a cow or a horse or something like that, livestock. So the big point of a lasso, like a real lasso, is it comes back to itself. Okay. Otherwise, it wouldn't form the circle that captures the animal and all that. So here I have this kind of awkward shape, and I'm going to go down here and I'm going to grab this thing called the lasso select. Okay. And what this allows you to do is instead of using a predefined circle or square selection, it lets you draw your own selection. Okay. So what I'm going to do is start from this lower right-hand corner, and I'm going to just kind of drag this tool, and I'm just dragging around my shape. Now, this is all based on my hand movement. So how steady your hand is plays a part in this. You might want to zoom in and use the navigation tools that we've talked about for zooming and panning. I'm using the space bar right now. Now I'm going to go fast for the sake of this demo not taking forever, but the point is I'm going to go back to the starting place here. Okay, when I let go, you can see it makes a selection. Okay, and if I use the move tool, it moves it in the same way that when I use the rectangular or the circle select. Just like with the rectangular or the circle select, you will notice I also have this feather option. So for instance, if I set this to a feather of like 14 or 15 and I draw something, you can see that I'm getting soft edges or blurred edges as opposed to crisp edges, just like with a rectangle and the circle select. I'm just going to set that to 0. And you can see now it goes back to nice crisp edges there. We also have the add and subtract. So for instance, if I were to draw something like this, I could use the add here to add to this, or I could use the subtract and whatever I draw as a circle or a closed shape, I should say, will cut away. Okay, in terms of my shape. Another thing to note is that when I lassos come back to themselves. And so if I were to let go at where my current marker is in the upper right-hand corner, it's going to go from my last point, which is in the upper right, to the first point, which is in the lower left, in the shortest distance possible. The shortest distance between 2 points in space, as said in geometry, would be a straight line. And so you can see it's creating that straight line there. So normally what I would really recommend is you go around the entire perimeter of the thing that you're trying to affect. Okay. All right, that is the lasso tool. But there's now the lasso tool is nice, but the issue with it is, well, it's based on your hand movements. And a lot of people don't have very sturdy surgical like hands. And so we need additional tools that can help. So we have additional lassos that we can use that have a different kind of, they're still lassos in the sense they come back to themselves, but the way they work is a little different. I'm going to click and drag or click and hold, I should say, and I'm going to use this one that says polygonal lasso select. And what this does is it's going to basically allow me to make lines. Okay. What's going to happen is I'm going to eventually lay down what are called anchors. And as I draw anchors, I'm going to be creating points or lines between those anchor points. And what's eventually going to happen, I'm just going to go fast for the sake of this demo. We're going to create a shape like the one here, and that is going to be our selection. So I'm going to use the polygonal select, and I'm going to click right at this lower left-hand corner, and I'm going to move over here. And I'm just kind of clicking and dragging. Now, if you make a mistake, what you can do is, use the delete key or the last key, use the backspace key, and that would remove the last anchor. So for instance, this is my last anchor. If I hit delete, it moves back. I can hit delete, it moves back. So this is a good way if you make mistakes that you kind of back up a little bit. Like with the original lasso, I need to go back to the origin point. Um, And what I'm going to do is try to click right there where it met up. And you can see now I've created this complete shape. And so if I use the move tool, I can move the whole thing. Like with the other ones, I do have the feather option and add and subtract. So if I wanted to maybe subtract this area here, I could do that. All right. Like with the original lasso I was showing, remember lassos always return back to themselves, right? So I'm right now in the upper right hand corner. Let's say I wanted to go down to the lower left hand corner. If I hit the return or the enter key, it's going to go from the last point up here down to the opening point here or the starting place. It's going to go in the shortest distance possible, which would be a straight line cutting through my shape here. All right. So that is the polygonal select. Now, the polygonal select is very good in that it gives us the ability to be very precise about what we select. The one problem with the polygonal, I would say, is it's very good for things with hard edges, like things like books or a building or something like that. But things that have more sort of curved shape or organic shape or something like that, it's not as good. So, there's one last kind of lasso that we're going to talk about, and it's called the magnetic lasso. As you can see, it's called magnetic lasso select. So let's talk about that. And before we talk about the way that the magnetic lasso works, we have to understand or how to use the tool. We have to understand how it's making its selections, and it's basing this off something called luminance. Okay. Luminance is this concept of how bright or dark something is within your image. Okay. Now, I'm making this black and white because I think it makes it easier to understand, but it doesn't have to apply just to black and white images. This can apply to color images as well. So the idea is like if I were to measure this photo or look at this photo in terms of lighting, there are places where the lighting is bouncing off of my scene, the very bright areas like this. We would refer to these as highlights. There's also the area where the light source is not getting to, like here. We would refer to those as the shadows, and then everything else in between, that is referred to as the midtones. Okay. So if I were to look at, say, this photo here, highlights, 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 highlights. Typically with humans, the way it works is like most time light sources are not always, but usually light sources are coming down, like the sun, or even you can see the lights behind me, they're coming down. So it's like there's light bouncing off of his forehead. This is because humans sometimes have oily skin, and the light source bounces off of the oily skin, creating this highlight. It also, like your shoulders, once again, because light's coming down, the bridge of your nose, same thing because your nose sticks out, right? So the sun source is bouncing off of it. There's also usually a little bit of oil on people's noses. So that's typically where are going to see highlights. Shadows are once again because most times light sources are coming down. So like underneath the chin, under the armpits, right? You can see how these are darker. Those would be where my shadows would be. And then everything else is kind of in between. It's kind of midtones. So here, highlights, shadows underneath the chin, inside of this, you can see the inside of the eyes, right? In the hair, and then midtones are everything in between. Now, why am I talking about luminance? Because the way that the magnetic tool works is it works on the idea of contrast. Okay. Contrast, at least when you talk about a luminance contrast, it's when you have two things that are far apart. So we measure luminance on a scale from 0 to 255. 0 is pure black, 255 is pure white, and then everything else is kind of like in between. So like a midtone would be like, 125 or something like that. The further the foreground and the background are from each other on this number list, the more contrast or the more it's going to stick out. So in other words, what I mean is like here, this is a pure black on a pure white background. So 0, 255, there's 255 variations of luminance. And so it stands out really high. Here, this is a white background with an off light gray. I'm making up a number here. So it's like, let's say that off gray was 190 and this is 255. So there's about 65 variations, okay? And that ends up having stuff with less contrast. Less contrast means it's harder to see the difference between the foreground and the background. It's not impossible, but it's less, right? This is obviously stands out much more than this, right? So what does that have to do with selecting things? So if you have an image where the foreground and background are easily defined from each other. So here I have this like old school metallic robot, right? Something out of Metropolis. And it's like, it's kind of this dark kind of gray, mid gray. Some parts are darker. And it's sitting on this white background. It's got some good contrast between the foreground and the background. So what I'm going to do is grab the magnetic tool and I'm just going to kind of click and drag around this, and you can see it's kind of snapping, right? You see how it's like snapping to the edges here? All right, so I'm going around. So remember, this is a lasso. So just like before, we got to go back to its origin. This is its origin. I'm gonna hit go back. If you're having issues, you can always hit sorry, I'm doing this for the sake of just going faster. You can hit enter or return to close off your shape, kind of like what we did with the polygonal. Also, if you make a mistake, just like we did with the polygonal, where we'd use the delete or the backspace key, you can do that here. So I'm going to kind of back up, removing those previous anchors. All right, and then, so I'm just going to go fast. You can see how it's like kind of snapping here, which is really nice. I'm going to go there. And then, I get a much more tighter selection there. Okay. So this is how you can use something like the different lasso tools here to make a much more complex scene and be able to make selections and things like that. Okay. So why don't you guys try that out? That was 3, 4, and 5, please.